Hello, everyone. Today I'm with Walton Stanley, and Walton is the president of the Minnesota Men's Conference. He's a storyteller, and he has a background in theatre and the arts as an actor over a long period of time. And Walton, welcome, firstly.
Thank you, John. Good to be here.
And, we were having a chat prior to today, and I recently spoke with Dick Russell, and The Life and the Ideas of James Hillman, Volume 2. And in James Hillman, Volume 2, is a chapter on men and mythopoetics. And it's an interesting period, it seems to me, and the beginning periods, and there's now, which we'll get onto as well. But it was when these two unlikely characters, Robert Bly, the kind of genius poet, and James Hillman, came together to be part of these programs. So I wanted to ask you, what was it all about? How did that begin? What were your thoughts about Hillman and Bly?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, my thoughts were we were very blessed to have encountered both of those men and those geniuses, really. How it began was it actually evolved, I think, out of Bly's work with the Great Mother Conference. So Robert started a conference called the Conference on the Great Mother and the New Father back in the mid to late 70s. Those conferences started, and I believe James Hillman was part of some of those too at some point. So Robert knew James, I think, through that and probably through other contacts. But somewhere in the early 80s, Robert got the sense that there was something lacking in men. There was a certain tempering in young men that wasn't happening, and there was a difference in tone, I think, between my generation, which at that time was kind of the post-Vietnam sort of hippie generation, if you will, coming off of that, the generation of the 70s and 80s. And there was a difference in the kind of gravity, if you will, or tempering of younger men. And there was also a lot of anger directed toward the father in men, especially in America, I think because of some of the betrayals around Vietnam. So there was a lot of distance between men and their fathers in this country around the events of Vietnam and other movements, civil rights and things like that were going on in America at the time.
Yeah.
So he noticed that, and that's when he started working with the Iron John story as a kind of map to male initiation, a map to that kind of tempering process. And so that's what the conferences came out of, his explorations around that. So that was the genesis of it. And pretty quickly, I don't remember which year James first came, might have been the second or third conference, something like that, but it was pretty early on that Robert brought James Hillman in to speak, and that was a very it was a very different notion. So the early conferences had Robert Bly and Michael Meade. We had the Aikido master Terry Dobson was there, and some other characters kind of leading things. They were built around story. They were built around discussion of ideas. And then when James came, it was much. He brought that kind of psychological groundings of talking about ideas of the psyche, of the soul.
Mm. I remember speaking to Dennis Patrick Slattery not so long ago, and he was at Kent State when there was the
shooting
at Kent State, and it was a big thing, wasn't it? It's like the father turned on the youth in a way.
It was very Saturnine, if you will. Yeah, it was like Kronos eating his children, sort of. I mean, the older men, you know, a lot of them, like my father was a World War II veteran, and so, you know, seeing a lot of the excesses of my generation too, you know, was very hurtful for them. So there were a lot of wedges, I think, between fathers and son, a lot of damage done between fathers and son. And I think in later years, a lot of that got reconciled, but that was very prominent in the early discussions of
the early start.
Yeah.
And there's kind of, you know, I remember Dick Russell saying that there was kind of that characterization, though, wasn't there, of bare-chested men running through the forest, banging on drums or whatever. But it's kind of like it's kind of like you're saying the guts of it was this whole thing of the absence of the father, or
well, that was a piece of it, and then I think the other piece was looking at, you know, how do men cultivate the heart, cultivate the soul, right? Connect with the soul, because that's the other piece of initiation, right? Is connecting with what the soul's purpose is, which of course fits very much in with all of Hillman's writings and things. So that was kind of the other piece, and of course the soul doesn't care much about social conventions necessarily. The soul wants beauty, the soul wants creativity, and so the way you access the heart can be, you know, through arts and through expression and stuff. So it did get expressive, of course, and one of the ways we did that was you know, learning some drum rhythms and playing on drums and you know, being in nature. We'd do these conferences, you know, in the woods at camps, you know, usually YMCA camps, something of that nature. So it was about connecting to the natural world, and also connecting to beauty in the soul. So there was always poetry. There was music and drumming and things like that that went on. That got caricatured in the public imagination, and it was also very, I think, threatening. It was posited as a reaction to the feminist movement of the time, and I don't think it ever really was that. It wasn't a reaction to feminism. It was, in a way, a reaction to undeveloped cultivation of the masculine heart.
And masculine initiation.
Yes, yeah.
We could say.
Yeah, and that was always talked about, but we you know, what Robert was doing was looking at old fairy tales like Iron John, which is, of course, his famous book on it. But what he was saying is that those tales are maps of initiation, and many of the tales have sort of alchemical imagery in them. You know, they go through color progressions or different kinds of things in the story, and so it's kind of either an initiatory or an alchemical initiatory journey that is documented in these old fairy tales, which are, I mean, evidence shows those tales are really old, like pre-literature old. So he was looking back at those stories saying, well, what would be the map to initiation? We've lost initiation, basically. We have elements of it. There are initiatory things. You know, we have baptism and confirmations and military training and things like that. Those have initiatory elements, but they aren't real initiation because those aren't necessarily connected to the soul of the individual, or the piece of the soul that the individual carries, and finding out what the soul wants of that individual life. So that was lost in European and Western culture. And that's what the conferences were examining, not with the idea that we would ever get there necessarily, but just to start the process. Well, some years later, we encountered actual people who were coming from indigenous traditions that were somewhat intact, like Malidoma Some and Martin Prechtel and Miguel Rivera and people like that, who had actually been through initiations and ceremonies and things like that. So we got a little more information and experience from them about those things. And of course, James Hillman was still on the scene, so it was very interesting to see him engage with the indigenous elders.
So is that mythopoetics?
Well, mythopoetics was a term that was coined by someone and applied to what we were doing. And we sort of used it because it kind of became the language. Robert Bly was never completely comfortable with that term. He wanted to call it, I think, the expressive men's movement or the feeling men's movement, something like that. Mythopoesis really means the creation of myth. And we weren't actually creating a myth. We were working with myth. We might have been recreating or remembering, putting back together myth, but we weren't creating it or developing a new mythos, right? We weren't developing a new story. In fact, we were using the oldest stories we could find, right?
So, but in a way, it could be going. Like, okay, yeah, I understand what you're saying, but mythopoetics is also going back into the first stories or the old stories in a way. Yeah. You could say it like that.
You could, yeah, you could, and that's been applied, and that's kind of the common name for the work, whether it's appropriate exactly or not. But yes, and of course, when you retell a story, right, you actually recreate it. It's not the same story. You're not just taking it off the page, right? You're embodying the story, giving it voice, and then the people who are hearing it are different. And so they're going to hear it in different ways and respond to it in different ways.
And yourself, Walton, how did you get involved? And storytelling, I wonder whether you could get onto that a little. How did you get involved in storytelling?
Sure. Well, I got involved in the men's conferences. I was in a small men's group that actually formed because the women we were associated with, including my wife, was in a women's group, a women's kind of support group, and they would have breakfast on Sundays and talk about whatever it was they wanted to talk about. And so there were a bunch of guys who were connected to these various women who had nobody to hang out with on Sunday morning. So we said, well, we can get together. So we started getting together and we formed this small men's group. One of the guys in that group brought, there was an article in New Age magazine, which was an interview of Robert Bly, where he talked about the Iron John story. He hadn't written the book yet, but he was thinking about the story. And so he brought the article, and then shortly thereafter, Robert was giving a talk here in Minneapolis, because Robert was based here in Minnesota. Yeah. So as a group, we all went, and at that meeting, at the end of it, Robert said, well, we should have one of these. I've done a few of these men's conferences. Let's do one here in Minnesota. And so he passed out a legal pad, and we all put our names down. And one of the guys in my group picked up the legal pad and said, I will produce this conference. And so then actually a couple of guys in that group did produce that first conference here in Minnesota. So that's how I got involved, and met Robert and Michael Mead and some other people. So storytelling, I got involved. When I heard Robert and Michael Mead telling stories in that way, that was a real revelation. I was a professional actor, but that was very different from the way they worked with stories and explored story and delved into it and kind of fed the story or gave, had people connect with the story, say where they are in the story, what they, in their life, and that kind of thing. So that kind of exploration was really really engaging for me. I started telling some stories, to kids and things like that, and to friends. We formed, the men that here in Minnesota formed another little men's council that would meet kind of monthly between the big conferences, and so we continued to kind of,
work the material,
and tell a story and work with material and talk about things and and play drums and all that kind of thing. So that went on for a while. So I started telling stories there a little bit, but didn't really do it at the conferences until we started doing some winter conferences that we formed. I was also in a kind of a Sufi singing group that met at Robert Bly's carriage house. Robert was part of it. And so, and I really got to know Robert personally through that. He'd been at the conferences. I knew him, but going to his house and singing and drinking tea and singing Sufi songs and reciting poems and things like that and talking, I really became he became a dear friend as well as a teacher. So we started producing these winter conferences or little weekends and things like that, and we needed someone to carry a story, and so I volunteered and started doing it, and now I'm doing it at the conferences. But we've had other storytellers and things as well, for sure. Martin Shaw has told stories for us, and marvelous storyteller Martin Prechtel carried stories in, and of course Robert and Michael Mead and Danny Deardorff was another fabulous storyteller. So we've been very, very blessed with people bringing a story.
I think there's something, what's the word, seductive in the right way, when it, like with good poetry, like sometimes what I've thought, like I remember the poetry at school, the Jabberwocky or something, like poetry wasn't the number one subject for me, but it's like, to me, Robert Bly has not only is his own poetry very beautiful, but the poetry that he loves. You only need to hear some good poetry for it to start to pull you in, and it's something like that with stories as well. And then it's seductive because it's taking you into something deeper and wider and into a mystery, basically, isn't it? And it's kind of like when I think of the present culture, it's kind of like the myth, the story, the poetry has been lost in the materialism, let's say. Well, that's one take on it. I mean, there's probably lots of takes on it, but it's kind of like that dimension has kind of been uneducated in us or lost or...
Yeah, it has, and particularly in kind of, I think, the consumer culture in the West, in America. I think one of Robert Bly's great contributions was was bringing a lot of poetry to America and to Americans, and different types of poetry. He really introduced America to Pablo Neruda in a very big way. He introduced Americans, and Coleman Barks to Rumi, and to Hafez and Kabir, and I like to say that in the early 1980s, the most read poet in America was Rod McEwen, who wrote, I've looked at clouds from both sides now, that kind of thing. And, by somewhere in the 90s, the most read poet in America was Rumi. And that's largely because of the
of
work of
Robert
Rod.
Bly and Coleman Barks. And I've often thought it's incredible that this guy in the south of the US, Coleman Barks, went off to a cafe and started working on these translations of Rumi. But
Robert actually encouraged him. He was the one that handed it to him and kind of said, I think the line was, these poems need to be taken out of their cages.
Yeah.
And that started Coleman on it, but yeah.
And they were taken out of their cages. I mean, when you think of it, you only have to look at Facebook now, and Rumi is kind of one of the major, he's one of the major men.
Yeah, absolutely.
Rumi would be very surprised if he saw what was happening.
Maybe, I don't know. It's hard to say. Rumi's a pretty wild character, so he might not be. But but other great poets. Robert was a great friend of the American poet William Stafford, who's just a lovely poet, and Robert really kind of introduced me, to Rilke and Stafford and Yeats and really, opening up to poetry. I mean, I was, like you said, I'd had poetry in school. We read Jabberwocky, we read The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, and and a few Shakespeare sonnets, and we were on our way. But yeah, to really engage with
the love of poetry.
Yeah, to enter into that in that way. We just had a poetry conference where we really focused on just poetry. We didn't tell a story or anything like that. We had a weekend conference this spring and just focused on the poetry, just to kind of make sure we were paying enough attention, because it had started getting, a little bit of short shrift in our conferences. So.
I think one of the things, when you talk about poetry, I think, one of the things is, in Iron John, there was, kind of like awakening the wild man within. And I think, again, we might have spoken a little bit about this before, but it's kind of like, I think when people hear wild, they get it. It's like we need to to me, wild is maybe, there's a mystical wild, like Rumi is wild, Nataraj from India, the dancing Nataraj is, it's a kind of a, what's the word? It's a natural, well, you could say it's a natural spirituality and mysticism within the human being, or something like that. Whereas people tend to think of wild as they think it might be a retreat back into primitive savagery or something along those lines.
And that's the projection, right? That's the projection on wild. And I remember Robert saying that he sort of wished he hadn't sort of used that phrase, wild man, because of that, because of the confusion with brutal man or that kind of thing. Now, a part of that is a kind of modernist projection on the wild, on indigenous, right? On indigeneity, that they're savages, right? Well, of course, indigenous people are in many ways have much more cultivated hearts, culturally, traditionally, when their societies haven't been ripped apart by colonization. Those were very sophisticated cultures with magnificent poetry, magnificent stories. There were, I don't know, 600, maybe 1,000 languages in North America. Every one of those has a literature much more vast than, or as vast as the Iliad and the Odyssey. Most of those languages, many of those languages are lost, and many of those memories, many of those stories were wiped out by colonization. So there's this projection of, the wild man, right, being a savage or being a brute. But, well, in fact, I would say it's a little bit the opposite, is the civilized
Well,
man.
well, we could also say, in looking at it another way, the wild man is the kind of responsible man that's been inducted into the first stories and myths.
Right.
Yeah. So,
yeah,
as you
yeah,
say, there's a kind of a mass. It's suited the modern Western culture to kind of project that onto the past.
yeah. I've actually written working on a book on the Gilgamesh story, and in that there's kind of the in literature the first wild man, which is the character Enkidu, who comes and is created by the gods to be kind of a counter and a friend to Gilgamesh, and Gilgamesh is the civilized man, and of course, that the wild man doesn't occur. The concept of wild, of wilderness, doesn't really occur until you have someplace else, until human beings pull themselves out of nature, right? Then nature becomes this foreign thing. Well, people talk about natural and artificial, but what's really outside of nature? Nothing. We sort of think we are that kind of anthropocentric, kind of human exceptionalism, which of course is basically eating the world as we speak.
As we talk now.
Yeah. There are fires on roads in Sardinia, and wildfires in Canada, and blowing smoke right across my backyard here. So.
Yeah, that's good. Natural is another word I would like to suggest, or in relation to the natural world.
Yeah, or in relation to the cosmos, to the rest of creation, right? Because we aren't apart from it. We never were. That's a fantasy of civilization.
And so over the years, Walton, I mean, as this has progressed from when was it, the late 70s that kind of things began, would you say?
So the first men's conference was here in Minnesota was 1984. I think Robert had done a couple of them in California and maybe Pennsylvania or something like that in 83, 82, something like that. But the first one here was in 84.
And so how has it changed? Like, I would say there's maybe a different zeitgeist now than what there was back in that time. Because back in that time, there was a big new age, wasn't there? And it was kind of the new age there and mainstream society there. And now it's a little bit of a different thing. So how have you changed, and what, or reinvented, or what do you do now?
Yeah. Well, it's, I think that's right. I mean, part of it is simply generational. I mean, most of the men who attended those early conferences were about my age. I was about 29 years old, 28 years old, something like that. And most of the men were my age peers who were there. There weren't very many. There were a few older men, but most of them were my age, or a little older. The men that have continued that work, I mean, many of those men, the poet Timothy Young is a dear friend of mine. I met at that first conference, and there's a number of men that I stay in contact with that I met at those early conferences. But the work itself, I mean, I think society has changed. We're coming up actually. So next year will be 2024 will be the 40th anniversary of that first conference. Yeah. And we're looking at kind of revisiting Iron John next year, and kind of to paraphrase James Hillman, we've had 40 years of men's conferences, and maybe the world is getting worse, but yeah, I mean, the conference itself, it evolved. So the early conferences were a lot of Robert and Michael, a lot of discussion, story discussion, things like that. When we had indigenous elders in, the focus changed more toward ritual. So we still always had stories and we always had discussions and things like that, but they moved more into bringing more ritual elements in and building toward a kind of ritual response. So taking taking the work from the conference hall, if you will,
Yeah.
from the story, and kind of dancing that back into the land, or bringing offering to spirits, and building shrines and doing that kind of work, which of course is very engaging. That wakes up the soul too, right? When you start building something beautiful out of a few sticks and things like that, and suddenly you have this kind of amazing shrine, and you're making offerings and singing songs and playing drums and lighting fires and things like that. That's another way to really wake up the soul and connect it to the larger soul. So it certainly went through that phase, and then we kind of lost some of the kind of first generation of leaders, if you will. Robert developed some dementia and wasn't able to really continue. Martin and Malidoma kind of moved into other areas and things, and so there was kind of a transitional period, and the 90s were fairly big, but by the 2000s, after 9/11 and things like that, attendance kind of dropped off and things were sort of petering out. And then we, kind of made some efforts to get men back and to get things going again, which we did. And then after a time, it just got really kind of expensive to do that work. A week-long conference at a camp where you're providing all the meals and the lodging and the costs and things like that. So we had to charge so much that a lot of men who are drawn to this work, for some reason, are not huge successes in the capitalist world. So we wanted to keep the cost down. So for a time, the conference kind of went to ground, if you will. We simplified. We looked at kind of shorter conferences, some cheaper options, and now we're kind of trying to expand again, but still kind of hold the cost down. So kind of play that edge. As far as the content of the conference, I don't think it's. It is different. We don't have Robert Bly and James Hillman there. Those are hard people to replace.
Yeah.
But we do have stories. We have discussions. We have ritual. We have poetry. We have singing. We're gonna do some artwork at this next conference and things like that. So all those elements are there, and all the things we've kind of learned from those teachers are there. And of course, we still have Miguel Rivera and Ben Dennis as a storyteller I work with, and a ritualist, and so
the new guard coming through.
Yeah, I don't think if you transported one of our conferences today back to 1984, I don't think anyone would be lost in it. Let's put it that way.
I remember
the society has changed.
I remember, one thing I've noticed is, I don't know, as in the early 70s or whatever, in that whole period where there was that whole, and it's a 60s thing, isn't it? You didn't trust anyone past kind of 28. They were.
Yeah. I trust anyone.
They were square kind of thing. And then quite an amazing thing that's happened to me over the last 5 or 10 years is to be able to appreciate the older men of society as mentors, and as people handing down the stories and the experience and things like that. And it's quite a lovely, it was something, if you think about it, there's that wonderful, what is excitement of youth or whatever, but that was really missing, it seems to me. That,
Yeah. Well, I mean, you're right. I mean, that was kind of the heyday of the New Age, and Esalen and all that kind of stuff was going on. So there was a lot of experimentation, a lot of exploration, and there is still some of that, but it's not quite it's not quite in the zeitgeist, right? Yeah. So the men's work was kind of coming out of some of that and kind of riding some of that wave, I think, which doesn't exist as much. Although, I see young men who are, I think, really hungry for this work. I think there are some channels that are kind of exploiting that hunger, but and turning the men away from the cultivated heart, turning toward machismo and turning towards brutality and kind of attacking the feminine and things like that, rather than connecting with with the feminine, and dealing with the feminine. So I think there are some kind of false prophets of men's work out there. But
well, it's a little more reactionary.
They really they are very hungry for this kind of work, and they do connect to it. We had a young man at our last conference who was an over-the-road truck driver, and he drove his truck to a truck stop and parked it and came to the conference. And it turned out he'd grown up in Russia and spoke Russian, so we had him read Anna Akhmatova in Russian at the conference, and he did just this beautiful. And then he translated on the fly and did just a marvelous job. So yeah, like I said, I think there's a lot of hunger for it. I don't know that they're necessarily finding us. We're probably the worst marketers in the world, but
I think it's been a real, I mean, I was saying this to someone the other day, maybe to Miguel or whatever, but as someone 20,000 kilometers away, that, I and John reached out, and, we were talking earlier about some of the books of Rumi and things, but it's kind of like that period is a phenomenon, really, and continues to be, but it's kind of like it's done important work in terms of, what is it? I would call it the soul making, to allow for the soul making of the human being, and often maybe for men, one of the worst things is being trapped in a role within society, which looks after the outer world to a certain degree, but isn't feeding the kind of inner development which is really necessary. And also I can get this idea of the initiation into the feminine now is also the initiation into the earth, the body, nature. So there's both sides to it. You know what I mean? It's not a one-sided thing. We're not just talking about learning from men or whatever. It's kind of like in traditional cultures, the boys went off with the men for a certain time, but then I remember Hillman saying that in midlife, often the initiation is more into the feminine for men. If the masculine becomes too one-sided, so it's kind of like now is like, and I think it's all of these things that your work has. It spreads out to other lands, and into other places. And it seems to me that in the present environment with the internet and everything like that, there's someone in Finland taking a lot from Danny Deardorff's story or something. Or there's me in West Australia listening to Danny Deardorff and going, wow, this guy can really talk.
Yeah.
And take you somewhere, and it's beautiful.
I think that's right. And I think, what Hillman was saying there is absolutely true. There is a different initiation. So initiation is often thought of as, a rite of passage from boyhood to manhood, and then you're done, but
Yeah.
initiation is lifelong. The stories are cyclical. They repeat, you keep going through the initiation. It's just you go through it at different stages. And I think, after you go through it about 10 times, you sort of learn the pattern. So it gets a little easier. But yeah, it is a different initiation. But initiations are also, I think, connections with mortality and with death, and negotiating with mortality and coming to terms with that. Because that's part of the cultivated heart, or the initiated experience, is saying, yeah, you know what? I eat food, I kill things, I devour things, and something's going to eat me too. And that's the deal I've made. We all owe a death, right? So, but being able to, I think, stand in that, to stand in one's mortality and say, yeah, that's okay. I'll enter the ancestral in whatever form that takes, and not fight against it. And I think that's part of the machismo and the kind of, anti-feminine thing. It's an effort to kill the Great Mother, to fend off the Great Mother, by bulking up our biceps or something. They're not going to win. The Great Mother is going to eat them just as well. Part of initiation is coming to terms with the fear of that, and being able to stand in a masculine body that is separate from the mother, that isn't identified with the mother, that is different than the mother, and knowing she's going to eat that body, and saying, that's all right. You got ancestors behind you. You're fine. That's part of initiation too. That's part of our work.
Yeah. Yeah. And at the end of the day, they're all soul initiations, aren't they?
Well, right. But if you're in terror of the Great Mother, then what do? Well, you try to escape the Earth. You build a rocket ship and you say you're going to colonize Mars, or
right.
Or you try to get to the singularity. I'm never going to die. I'll upload my consciousness. You're seeking mortality, right? Which is from the Gilgamesh story again. It's first thing in civilization. He sees Enkidu die. He realizes it's going to happen to him, and he goes off to find a way to beat death, to achieve physical immortality. He fails, of course, but
I think what I'm getting from what you're saying is, that these initiations that used to take place traditionally were there for a reason. So that people made a transition from one life stage to another, or whatever, going on. And sometimes they don't really happen. So that in the present society, they're just not necessarily happening. So that thing of wanting to escape the Great Mother, or escape the Earth, is just being played out within within the world of technology as we speak.
Right. And the world of technology is really trying to insulate ourselves from the Great Mother, right? We're trying to insulate ourselves from the rest of creation. We're putting up our walls, we're air conditioning them, we're separating them, and while we burn the world to do it, And the attack is really on the mother, right? We're mining her, we're ripping down the forests, we're devouring her like titans.
Yeah. Yeah, okay. Well, that might be a good place. Thank you very much, Walton, and thanks for sharing that story. That might be a good place for us to finish up.
Sounds good, John. Thanks for having me.